Hey, Center Grace family, happy Wednesday. We are going to jump back into our discussion about daily gospel renewal this week. And if you remember, over the last numbers of weeks, we've been trying to compare daily gospel renewal to a number of the daily rhythms that we have each and every day in our normal experience as we go through life. And so remember, the first week we started out talking about how every day we all look into a mirror. And we drew out this little image that look like this. And we talked about how every time we look into the scriptures, just like it says in James 1, we look into the perfect law, which is like a mirror that gives freedom. We grow in our awareness of God's holiness, and we grow in our awareness of our sinfulness. And that's what happens when we begin looking into the mirror. But we talked about how it's so important. Another rhythm is that if this represents the mirror, we also talked about how numbers of us have to put on glasses or contacts. And we talked about the idea of focus. What do we focus on? What helps us see properly? And we talked about how all the time the cross is supposed to be growing as we grow in our awareness of God's holiness and our sinfulness. Otherwise, there's going to be a gap at the top. And if the cross just stays this big throughout all of our lives, we're going to feel like we have to somehow legalistically earn our way to God, and we practice self-righteousness if we're not careful. Or if we feel the depth of our sinfulness, sometimes we can enter into despair. And so we have to focus on the cross. But what specifically about the cross? And we use the acrostic Yeshua, J-S-H-A, justification. I've been accepted because of Christ. Sanctification, I'm being transformed by the presence of Christ. The Holy Spirit, I'm not alone in my battle against sin, and authority in spiritual conflict. That God has given us the authority, that He is subduing both our enemies and even ourselves to Himself because of His grace through faith. So our focus is on Jesus. It's on the cross. It's on justification, sanctification, the Holy Spirit, and authority in spiritual conflict. And daily, we need to remind ourselves of that. When we're looking into the mirror, we've got to put on our glasses or our contacts to look at Jesus. But then we also talked about a daily rhythm of diet and exercise. And one of the things that we compared this to is in Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. This is where Paul says, work out your salvation. That's the exercise piece. With fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you. That's like the diet. That's the food that we ingest. It's God who works in you to will and to act according to His good purpose. And when we talked about this a number of weeks ago, we talked about how there's both a personal and a corporate dimension to these things. Isn't it more fun to eat food with people? It is. It always is. And isn't it more easy to work out or to hold ourselves accountable to working out when we're with other people as well? So again, we have to look out after what we're eating. We have to engage in exercise, but it's always good to have that accountability as well. And we talked about how, again, these things are like the process or the daily rhythm of both what we're ingesting and then missional living as we're working out what God is doing. And then last week, we talked a little bit about the rhythm between work on the one hand and rest on the other. And we talked about how there's supposed to be like a pendulum that swings back and forth in our lives. But all too often, what ends up happening is that we end up living life just pegged over here toward the work dimension. And we began talking about how we need this daily rhythm, and God gives us a daily rhythm of sleep and being awake, of going to bed at night and getting up to do work. But biblically, the day begins with us resting. It starts, there's evening and there's morning, the first day and the second day and the third day. There's that rhythm that daily we need to enter into rest and work. But now, today, I want to talk a little bit about Sabbath. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the Sabbath is, and then there's definitely misapplication of how we enter into a weekly rhythm of rest. And this is, I think, really important when we think about gospel renewal, because the Sabbath is actually there for us to be renewed by God weekly. It's a helpful rhythm for us to enter into that reminds us of the gospel. One of my professors in college actually said that the Sabbath command in the Ten Commandments he said it was like the good news of the law. Now, what he meant by that was there was a reminder within the Ten Commandments that God's people couldn't earn their way to Him. and that every week they needed to remind themselves of that reality. And he went on to say that actually Israel's practice throughout all of their history was in essence one big practice of Sabbath breaking instead of Sabbath keeping. But the question that we need to grapple with, and that I think all of God's people, and especially you see this in the New Testament with the Pharisees, needed to grapple with was, how in the world can the most freeing, celebratory command be turned into the most oppressive and constraining one? Because when you read the New Testament and you read the way that the Pharisees thought about the Sabbath and the way that even many of us sometimes think about it and have been taught about it, it becomes this oppressive and constraining thing, right? Well, there have been a lot of Sabbath responses throughout the ages. There are still a number of Sabbath responses. One of them, even today, is very similar to the Pharisees in the New Testament, right? The emphasis is always on the thou shalt not. Here are the things that you cannot do on the Sabbath. Now remember, the Pharisees had a list of 600 things that you could not do on the Sabbath. But then there are other people who, for fear of legalism, they just kind of plow through the Sabbath. They're like, I don't even know what to do with it, so I'm not even going to try. I'm just going to blow through it. And what they end up doing is, in essence, living their life pegged out on the issue of work. They're not entering into a weekly understanding of rest. And Jesus gives this great teaching in Mark chapter 2, verses 23 through 28, where he and his disciples are walking through the grain fields on the Sabbath day. And remember the story that the disciples begin plucking some of the heads of grain. And the Pharisees see this, and they think the disciples are working. And they say, hey, why are your disciples doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? They shouldn't be doing this. Again, their emphasis is constantly on the not. And so then Jesus gives this teaching. He says to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those with him? How he entered into the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And also David gave it to all those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath. Now, I don't want to take too much time unpacking this, and there's a ton to it. But in essence, in verses 23 and 24, when the Pharisees see Jesus' disciples picking heads of grain on the Sabbath, their emphasis is always on the thou shalt not. That was the part of the rhythm that they focused on week in and week out. We can't do this. We can't do that. We can't do this. That's why they came up with 600 laws. But Jesus' emphasis when it comes to the Sabbath seems to be on the exact opposite thing. Go back and look at all of the times when Jesus would argue with the Pharisees about the Sabbath. And it seems to me that Jesus is not just challenging their actions on the Sabbath. He's challenging something deeper, their attitude. He's challenging their mindset towards the Sabbath. Jesus is always emphasizing the freedom, the celebration, the joy that the Sabbath is supposed to be, rather than this constraint, this oppressive force that the Pharisees seem to emphasize. And Jesus was basically trying to tell the Pharisees over and over again that what their aim seemed to be on was not really honoring the God who made the Sabbath, but rather maybe honoring themselves and how strictly they kept the Sabbath. Jesus was just trying to tell them that rather than entering into the joyful rest that God had given them on the Sabbath, they were just focusing on what they could and couldn't do on the Sabbath. And so Jesus tells this strange story. He ties the Sabbath day to this experience that David had when he was on the run back in the Old Testament. And how David got the bread of the presence and he gave it to the people who were with him when they were fleeing from Saul. Now, again, there's a lot to that. We don't have time to unpack it all, but I want you just to notice that what Jesus seems to be doing is comparing the bread of the presence to the Sabbath day. Now, if you remember, the bread of the presence in the Old Testament was supposed to represent the manna that God used to provide for his people when they were wandering, and how God would always provide for his people. And then Jesus actually compares that bread of the presence to the Sabbath day. And what David had done is he went to the high priest and he got that bread and he shared it with the people. And Abiathar was okay with that because, again, the bread of the presence was to be a reminder to the priests that God had provided for his people. It's kind of strange, but then you begin to see the connection, right? The Pharisees should have known that the Sabbath was God's provision to his people. And that's exactly where Jesus goes. In verse 27, it's the main point of the text. Jesus says, the Sabbath was made for man. It's God's provision for you. You weren't made for the Sabbath. You don't keep the Sabbath day holy. You enter into the holiness of the day, but you can't make it more or less holy by what you do or don't do. God makes it holy. You just enter into the holiness of the day. So what does all this mean when you begin to think about it? How in the world should we go about practicing the Sabbath? Well, again, one thing just to keep in mind is that the Sabbath is for our benefit. It's something that we are to enter into as part of this rhythm of rest and work weekly to be renewed by the gospel. But there's also something that we need to recognize is that we were not made for the Sabbath. We can't perform for the benefit of that day in no way, shape, or form. We enter into what God has already made and declared holy and a delight. Listen to these two quotes. William Willimon, professor at Duke University, says, Sabbath keeping is a publicly enacted sign of our trust that it is God who keeps the world. Therefore, we don't have to. God welcomes our labors, but our contributions to the world have their limits. And if God even trusted creation enough to be confident that the world would continue while he rested, then so should we. Now, Willimon overstates it a little bit. God is always sustaining the world, right? But you get his point. If God is able to enter into a day of rest, my goodness, why in the world can't we? Another quote from Abraham Heschel, great Jewish rabbi. He once said that observing the Sabbath is not only about refraining from work, but it's about creating menucha, which is a Hebrew word meaning restfulness that is celebration. But listen to this. The Sabbath is a day for body as much as it is for the soul. The only sin is to be sad on the Sabbath. I love that. What he basically is saying when he talks about that is that the Sabbath isn't just a day for our spirits, not just a day for the immaterial part of us. The Sabbath is also a day for us physically. One of the things that many people throughout history have done to celebrate the Sabbath is to have big feasts, to invite people over for fellowship and eat together. But the bottom line is, one of the questions you need to ask when you think about your practice of entering into the rest, a weekly rhythm of rest on the Sabbath, is do you get refreshed by your Sabbath practice? Do you get refreshed? Are you renewed by it weekly? Do you feel restored that you're able to enter into your work week from a place of restoration and rest? Because if you're not, then you're probably not keeping the Sabbath. Again, at the end of the day, there are only three things that it seems like the scriptures declare about the Sabbath. One, stop working. Just knock it off for a day. Take a break. Secondly, worship. Delight in who God is and in what he's done. And then third, celebrate. Do the things that you enjoy that are going to make much of God. Those are the things that we need to do to practice this weekly rhythm of Sabbath. What will you do this week to stop working, to worship God, and to really celebrate? We love you guys, and we look forward to seeing you soon.